Every night, through biting cold and swirling snow, a scruffy dog named Milo sat faithfully outside the hospital doors, his eyes locked on the entrance as if waiting for a miracle. Most people brushed him off as just another stray. But when a hardened surgeon decided to uncover the truth, he unraveled a story so heart-wrenching and powerful that it would change the lives of everyone involved. What started as an ordinary night would soon turn into a battle for loyalty, love, and justice that no one saw coming. Every night, as the city drifted into silence and the hospital lights reflected off the icy pavement, Milo sat motionless, a lone figure in the swirling snow. His matted fur clung to him like a thin coat, offering little protection against the bitter cold. Yet, he never wavered, his gaze fixed on the hospital doors, as though willing someone or something to emerge. The staff whispered about him, calling him the waiting dog. But no one dared to intervene. That was until Dr. Jonathan Harper stepped into the picture. Jonathan Harper was a man known for his precision, both in surgery and in life. Emotions were a luxury he couldn't afford, and sentimentality had no place in his meticulously structured world. But something about Milo stopped him in his tracks that night. The dog's eyes, pools of silent longing, seemed to hold a story that Jonathan couldn't ignore. For the first time in years, the hardened surgeon felt the faintest tug at his heart. Before I share what happens next in this unforgettable story of love, loss, and redemption, let me connect with you, my amazing viewers. Have you ever felt that unspoken connection with an animal? The kind that transcends words? If so, hit that like button and share your story in the comments below. And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from. Drop your country's flag so we can see how far this tale of loyalty and hope can travel. The first time Jonathan noticed Milo, he muttered, "What's this dog waiting for?" But as he walked away into the warmth of the hospital, the image of Milo lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the dog's stillness that haunted him, but the weight of his silent vigil. Was he abandoned? Was he lost? Or was he holding on to something or someone Jonathan couldn't yet understand? The following evening, Jonathan couldn't resist another look. As he stepped outside, Milo was there, sitting in the exact same spot, now covered in a thin blanket of snow. A nurse walking by paused, her voice soft with pity. "That dog's been here for weeks, doctor. They say he's waiting for someone. A patient. Maybe." Jonathan frowned, glancing back at the hospital doors. "Waiting for someone," he repeated under his breath. The phrase gnawed at him, planting a seed of curiosity he couldn't shake. He crouched a few feet away from Milo and whispered, "What's your story, boy?" Milo didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes, deep with emotion, met Jonathan's briefly before returning to the hospital doors. It was as if he was saying, "You're not the one I'm waiting for." Jonathan straightened up, torn between his pragmatic instincts and the growing pull of this mysterious dog's plight. That night, as he lay in bed, Milo's gaze followed him into his dreams, setting in motion a journey that would lead him to uncover more than just the truth about a dog. It would lead him to rediscover his own humanity. The next evening, Jonathan found himself lingering by the hospital doors longer than usual. The snow had stopped, leaving behind a quiet chill in the air. And there was Milo, just as before, his small body curled up against the cold. This time, Jonathan brought a blanket he had grabbed from the backseat of his car. Slowly, he approached, crouching down a few feet away. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," he murmured, his voice soft, almost reluctant. He extended the blanket cautiously, half expecting Milo to run. But the dog didn't move. Instead, Milo lifted his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Jonathan's. There was no fear, no aggression, just an unspoken sadness that seemed to weigh heavier than the snow around him. Jonathan draped the blanket over Milo and stood, his breath visible in the icy air. "I don't know what you're waiting for, but it's not out here tonight," he said quietly. Yet, as he walked to his car, the feeling returned, that inexplicable pull to understand this dog's story. Over the next few nights, Jonathan began to notice things he hadn't before. Milo's focus never shifted from the hospital's revolving doors. He didn't follow passersby or react to voices calling to him. It was as if he was waiting for a specific face, one he knew would return. The staff had grown used to his presence, some leaving scraps of food for him. But Milo's behavior never changed. He was patient, steadfast, and heartbreakingly loyal. One particularly cold night, Jonathan stopped again, this time with a bowl of warm water and some leftover chicken. "Let's see if you'll take this," he said, setting the food down a few feet away. Milo sniffed cautiously but didn't move until Jonathan backed away. Then, slowly, the dog edged forward and ate, his movements hesitant yet deliberate, as though even the act of eating felt secondary to his true purpose. A janitor passing by chuckled. "You've taken a liking to that mutt." "Huh?" he said, leaning on his broom. "Poor guy's been here for weeks. Word is he's waiting for his owner. Some think it's a patient who never came out." Jonathan frowned, the janitor's words sticking with him. Patient who never came out. It was a chilling thought, but one that felt too plausible. The hospital wasn't just a place of healing. It was also a place of final goodbyes. Could Milo's owner have been one of those? The idea gnawed at him through his evening shift. As he reviewed patient files late into the night, Jonathan found himself pulling up recent records. There had been dozens of cases, but one name stood out: Edward Hill, an elderly man with no next of kin who had been admitted for heart complications 3 weeks ago. He had passed away shortly after, and according to the notes, his only listed companion was a dog, a small brown one. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. Edward Hill. The timing matched. The description matched. Could Milo be his dog? And if so, how had he found his way here? The questions buzzed in Jonathan's mind as he shut off his computer. The image of Milo sitting in the snow once again burned into his thoughts. The next morning, he decided to take a step further. During his lunch break, he asked the receptionist if anyone had reported a missing dog. "Not that I know of," she replied, clicking through files. "You think it belongs to a patient?" "Maybe," Jonathan said, though he was starting to feel certain. "Let me know if anyone asks about him." As the days passed, Jonathan began to feel a growing responsibility for Milo. He brought food and water nightly, staying a little longer each time, speaking softly to the dog even though he knew Milo wouldn't answer. And yet, in those quiet moments, something unspoken seemed to pass between them, a fragile thread of understanding, an acknowledgement of shared loneliness. Still, the mystery remained. What was keeping Milo here? Was it grief, hope, or something else entirely? Jonathan knew he couldn't stop now. He had to find the answers not just for Milo, but for himself. A week later, Jonathan found himself standing at the entrance of an overgrown garden. The house before him was modest, its shutters faded and paint peeling, but it still carried a warmth, as if it had once been a home filled with love. This was Edward Hill's address, the last place he had lived before the hospital became his final stop. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, unsure of what he expected to find. The dog's story had consumed his thoughts, and now, standing on the threshold of answers, he felt the weight of everything Milo had endured. He knocked gently on the door, but the silence that greeted him only confirmed what he already knew. The house had been empty since Edward's passing. He tried the door, but it was locked. Turning to leave, he noticed a neighbor across the street tending to her flower bed. "Excuse me," he called out, walking toward her. "I'm Dr. Harper, from the hospital. I'm looking into Edward Hill. Did you know him?" The woman straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Edward? Oh, bless his soul. Such a kind man. Lived there for years after his wife passed. But why are you asking now?" Jonathan glanced back at the house, then at the woman. Did Edward have a dog? Her expression softened. "Oh, yes, Milo. That little dog was his shadow. Followed him everywhere. I assume someone took Milo in after Edward passed. Jonathan felt a knot form in his chest. Milo's been sitting outside the hospital for weeks. It's like he doesn't know Edward's gone. The woman's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. That poor thing. He must be waiting for Edward to come back. Jonathan thanked her, but the conversation left a heavy weight on his heart. Milo's vigil wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a testament to love that refused to fade, even in the face of loss. He returned to the hospital that evening, stopping by the familiar spot where Milo sat. This time, he crouched down beside the dog, his voice soft. "I met your neighbor today," he said, as if Milo could understand. "She told me about Edward, about you. You've been waiting all this time, haven't you?" Milo turned his head slightly, his deep brown eyes meeting Jonathan's. In them, Jonathan saw something he couldn't quite explain, recognition, maybe, or an unspoken plea. He reached out, his hand hovering just above Milo's fur before finally resting on the dog's head. Milo didn't pull away. For the first time, he stayed still, allowing the touch, as if some small part of him understood he wasn't alone anymore. Jonathan stayed with Milo that night, longer than he intended. He felt a strange sense of calm sitting beside the dog, as though they were both waiting for something neither could put into words. When he finally stood to leave, Milo's gaze followed him, and for the first time, Jonathan felt like he was being entrusted with a responsibility far greater than himself. The next morning, Jonathan made a decision. He couldn't leave things as they were. Milo deserved more than a cold doorstep and an endless vigil. Edward's story wasn't over yet, and neither was Milo's. Jonathan just had to figure out how to write the next chapter. A few days later, Jonathan returned to Edward's house, this time armed with tools to unlock the mysteries hidden within. After obtaining permission from the local authorities to access the home, he stepped inside, unsure of what he would find. The air was stale, the silence heavy, but the space carried a distinct warmth, as if the walls themselves remembered Edward's quiet kindness. The living room was modest but tidy, with shelves filled with books and framed photos. Jonathan scanned the room, his eyes landing on one photo in particular. Edward sitting in an old armchair with Milo curled at his feet. It was clear from the way Edward's hand rested protectively on Milo's head that the two had shared an unbreakable bond. The sight brought a lump to Jonathan's throat. As he moved through the house, he noticed signs of Edward's solitary life. A mug left on the kitchen counter, a blanket draped over the couch. In the corner of the living room, he found a small basket filled with dog toys, each one worn with use. But it wasn't until he reached the bedroom that Jonathan discovered something that stopped him cold. A handwritten letter on the nightstand, addressed simply to Milo. Jonathan unfolded the letter carefully, the weight of its words pressing against his chest even before he began to read. "My dearest Milo, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here, but I need you to know how much you've meant to me. You gave me purpose when I had none. You filled my days with joy and my nights with peace. I only wish I could have stayed longer. For you, I don't know what will happen to you now, but if you find someone kind, someone patient, let them love you the way I did. You deserve that, my boy. And if you don't, well, I know you'll keep waiting. You've always been so loyal, more than I ever deserved. Thank you for everything. I love you, always, Edward." Jonathan's hands trembled as he folded the letter. He could almost feel Edward's love radiating from the page, a love so profound it had transcended even death. Milo hadn't just lost his owner. He'd lost the person who had been his entire world. And yet, through it all, Milo had waited faithful, unwavering, and hopeful. Jonathan left the house with the letter tucked safely in his pocket, his resolve stronger than ever. When he arrived back at the hospital, Milo was in his usual spot, staring at the doors as if waiting for Edward to walk through them. Jonathan crouched beside him, pulling out the letter. "I found something today," he said softly. "Edward wrote it for you. I think it's time you knew." He read the letter aloud, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. As the words hung in the cold night air, Milo tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching as if he could understand. When Jonathan finished, Milo leaned forward, resting his head gently on Jonathan's knee. It was the first time Milo had truly let his guard down. And in that moment, Jonathan knew what he had to do. "You're coming home with me," he whispered. "Not as a replacement for Edward, but because I think he'd want you to have a family again. I think he'd want you to feel safe." The next evening, with the help of a nurse, Jonathan coaxed Milo into his car. The dog hesitated at first, but something in Jonathan's calm demeanor seemed to reassure him. As they drove away, Milo sat quietly in the passenger seat, his gaze shifting between Jonathan and the road ahead. At Jonathan's house, Milo was introduced to a warm bed, fresh food, and a safe space to call his own. First, he explored cautiously, sniffing every corner as if searching for Edward's presence. But over time, he began to settle, following Jonathan from room to room and curling up at his feet during the quiet hours. For Jonathan, it was a strange yet welcome change. His house, once sterile and silent, now felt alive. Milo's presence filled the emptiness, bringing a sense of companionship Jonathan hadn't realized he needed. Yet, even as Milo adapted to his new life, there were moments when his eyes lingered on the front door, as if still waiting for someone who would never return. Late one evening, as Jonathan sat on the couch with Milo by his side, he unfolded Edward's letter again. "He loved you so much," he said softly, scratching behind Milo's ears. "And I promise, I'll do everything I can to honor that love." Milo wagged his tail faintly, his trust in Jonathan growing with each passing day. For the first time in years, both man and dog were beginning to heal, bound by the legacy of a man who had taught them both the meaning of loyalty. Over the next few weeks, Milo began to settle into his new life with Jonathan. The dog's cautious demeanor softened, and moments of trust became more frequent. Milo started greeting Jonathan at the door when he returned from work, his tail wagging faintly, and would rest his head on Jonathan's knee during quiet evenings. Yet, every so often, Milo would sit by the window, staring out at the street with a quiet longing that Jonathan understood all too well. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Jonathan found himself lingering by the framed photo of Edward and Milo he had brought home from Edward's house. The picture had become a centerpiece on his mantel, a silent reminder of the bond between the man and his dog. As he stared at it, an idea began to form, one that felt both daunting and necessary. The next morning, Jonathan made his way to the hospital, his thoughts consumed by the plan taking shape in his mind. He stopped by the front desk, where Sophia, the nurse who had first mentioned Milo to him, greeted him with a warm smile. "You look like a man on a mission," she said, handing him his usual coffee. "I suppose I am," Jonathan replied, taking a sip. "Sophia, I need your help. It's about Milo." Sophia's expression softened. "What about him?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment before explaining. Edward didn't just leave behind a dog, he left behind a legacy. The way Milo stayed outside this hospital, waiting, it's not just loyalty, it's love. And I think we need to honor that. Sophia listened intently as Jonathan outlined his vision. A project called Edward's Haven, a sanctuary for animals whose owners were hospitalized or had passed away. The idea was simple but powerful, a place where pets could be cared for while their humans healed or, in some cases, where they could find new families. "That's incredible," Sophia said, her voice filled with emotion. "Edward would have loved that. And Milo, he's the perfect inspiration." They spent the next few days rallying support. Jonathan reached out to colleagues, community members, and local businesses, sharing Edward and Milo's story. People were moved by the tale of a dog's unwavering loyalty and a man's quiet love. Donations began pouring in, and volunteers stepped forward, eager to help bring Edward's Haven to life. Meanwhile, Milo seemed to sense the change in Jonathan. The once cautious dog began to thrive, his tail wagging more often, his eyes brighter. He had become a symbol not just of loyalty, but of resilience, a living testament to the power of love. One rainy afternoon, Jonathan and Sophia visited the shelter they hoped to renovate into Edward's Haven. The building was old and in need of repairs, but as Jonathan walked through the empty halls, he could envision the transformation, a space filled with warmth, where animals like Milo could find safety and care. "We're going to make this happen," Jonathan said, his voice steady with determination. "For Edward, and for every animal like Milo." Sophia nodded, her eyes glistening. "You're giving them more than just a place to stay. You're giving them hope." As work on Edward's Haven began, Milo became the heart of the project. His story resonated with everyone who heard it, inspiring people to donate, volunteer, and adopt. Local media picked up on the story, dubbing Milo the waiting dog. And soon, Edward's Haven became a beacon of hope for the entire community. But even as the project flourished, Jonathan knew there was one final step to complete Edward's legacy. Late one evening, he sat by the fire with Milo curled up at his feet, the soft crackle of the flames filling the room. In his hand was Edward's letter. "Tomorrow, we'll do something special," Jonathan said quietly, stroking Milo's fur. Something to let Edward know his love didn't end with him. The next day, Jonathan and Sophia organized a small memorial for Edward in the park he had often visited with Milo. Neighbors, hospital staff, and volunteers gathered, sharing stories of Edward's kindness and Milo's devotion. Jonathan stood before the crowd, holding Milo's leash in one hand and Edward's letter in the other. Edward Hill was a man who understood the meaning of love. Jonathan began, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. He gave his heart to a little dog who never stopped loving him back. And today, we honor that love not just by remembering Edward, but by continuing his legacy through Edward's Haven. As the crowd applauded, Milo sat quietly by Jonathan's side, his eyes reflecting the quiet wisdom of a soul who had known both loss and love. Together, they had found a way to carry Edward's dream forward, ensuring that his story and Milo's would inspire hope for years to come. Jonathan stood in the center of the shelter that would become Edward's Haven, surveying the dusty floors and cracked walls. The building was in rough shape, far from the sanctuary he envisioned, yet, as he imagined it filled with animals finding safety and love, he felt a surge of determination. Beside him, Milo sniffed the air curiously, as though sensing that this was more than just a building. It was the beginning of something extraordinary. The project had quickly garnered attention after Jonathan and Sophia shared Edward and Milo's story with the community. Donations had started pouring in, and volunteers were eager to help. But as the reality of the undertaking set in, so did the challenges. Renovating the building would require more money and resources than they initially thought. And time was running out. Winter was approaching, and Jonathan knew they needed to get the shelter operational as soon as possible. One morning, as Jonathan and Sophia reviewed the mounting costs, a local contractor named Peter walked into the makeshift office they had set up in the old building. "I heard about what you're doing here," Peter said, holding out a hand. "My crew and I want to help. We can't donate much money, but we'll give you our time." Jonathan was taken aback by the gesture. "That's incredibly generous," he said, shaking Peter's hand firmly. "We could use all the help we can get." The next week, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air as volunteers worked tirelessly to transform the old structure into a warm, inviting space. Walls were painted, broken windows were replaced, and heating systems were installed to ensure the shelter would be ready for the cold months ahead. Milo became a familiar presence on the site, wandering from room to room and occasionally stopping to rest by someone's side, his quiet demeanor bringing a sense of calm to the bustling activity. Despite the progress, obstacles continued to arise. A critical permit for the shelter's operation was delayed, threatening to stall the entire project. Jonathan spent sleepless nights making phone calls and writing appeals, determined not to let bureaucracy derail Edward's dream. "We've come too far to stop now," he told Sophia one evening, his voice resolute. The community rallied around them during these setbacks. Local businesses offered supplies at discounted rates, and a fundraising event organized by Sophia brought in enough money to cover the remaining renovation costs. The event itself was a testament to the power of Milo's story. Families arrived with their pets, eager to meet the dog who had inspired such an outpouring of compassion. Milo, ever the quiet hero, greeted them with gentle eyes and a wagging tail, as though he understood the importance of the moment. As the shelter neared completion, Jonathan found himself reflecting on how much had changed. His once solitary life was now filled with purpose and connection. And it was all because of a scruffy dog who had refused to give up. "You're the reason we're here, Milo," he said one evening, scratching behind the dog's ears as they sat on the front steps of the nearly finished building. "Edward's dream lives on because of you." Finally, on a crisp autumn morning, Edward's Haven opened its doors. The first animals to arrive were a group of stray dogs rescued from a nearby industrial area. They came in frightened and skittish, but under the care of the dedicated staff and volunteers, they began to relax. Watching these animals find comfort and safety, Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. As the shelter settled into its operations, Jonathan and Sophia realized that their work was only just beginning. They had succeeded in creating a haven for animals in need, but maintaining it would require ongoing effort and resources. Yet, they knew they weren't alone. The community that had come together to build Edward's Haven was still there, ready to support the mission in any way they could. One evening, as Jonathan closed up the shelter for the day, he paused to look at the sign above the door. "Edward's Haven, a shelter of hope." Milo sat beside him, his gaze steady and calm. "We did it," Jonathan said softly, "but there's so much more to do." Milo wagged his tail, his presence a quiet affirmation of the journey they had taken together. For Jonathan, the challenges they had faced were a reminder that love and loyalty could overcome even the greatest obstacles. And for Milo, the shelter was more than just a place. It was proof that Edward's love would never be forgotten. The days at Edward's Haven had settled into a steady rhythm. Animals came through the doors frightened, some injured, others simply lost, but they left with wagging tails, purring hearts, and a renewed sense of trust. Milo, now a permanent fixture of the shelter, greeted each newcomer with calm reassurance. To the volunteers and visitors, he was more than just a dog, he was the soul of the place, a living reminder of Edward's love. But peace rarely lasts forever. One evening, as Jonathan was finishing his rounds at the shelter, Sophia burst through the door, her face pale with urgency. "Jonathan," she said, catching her breath, "there's been a chemical spill at the industrial park on the other side of town. They're evacuating the area, but there are reports of stray animals trapped in the flood zone." Jonathan's stomach tightened. The industrial park was notorious for the number of abandoned dogs and cats that roamed its perimeter. If the area was being evacuated, the animals wouldn't stand a chance unless someone acted quickly. "We'll go," Jonathan said without hesitation. "We have the space, and we have the resources. Let's get the team together." Within an hour, a group of volunteers had assembled at the shelter. They loaded crates, food, medical supplies, and blankets into the van that had become the backbone of Edward's Haven. Milo sat alert in the front seat, as though he understood the urgency of the situation. The van rolled out into the night, its headlights cutting through the darkness as the rain began to fall. When they arrived at the industrial park, the scene was chaos. Floodwaters churned through the streets, carrying debris and chemicals that painted the air with a sharp, acrid smell. Jonathan and his team split into groups, wading through the waist-deep water with flashlights, calling out for animals. The sound of barking echoed faintly in the distance, leading them to a crumbling warehouse where several dogs had taken refuge on the second floor. Sophia and another volunteer climbed a shaky metal staircase to reach the terrified animals, coaxing them gently into crates. Meanwhile, Jonathan spotted movement under a collapsed awning. He approached cautiously and found a small dog shivering beneath the wreckage. Its fur soaked and its eyes wide with fear. Milo appeared beside him, nudging the dog gently with his nose as if to say, "You're safe now." With Milo's calming presence, Jonathan managed to lift the dog into his arms and carry it back to the van. The rescue mission stretched into the early hours of the morning. By the time the team returned to the shelter, they had saved over 20 animals, some injured, others scared but unharmed. The shelter's medical area buzzed with activity as volunteers worked tirelessly to clean wounds, administer medication, and provide food and warmth. Milo moved quietly among the animals, his presence soothing even the most frightened ones. As dawn broke, Jonathan slumped into a chair, exhaustion washing over him. He looked around the room at the rescued animals, now resting in safety, and at the volunteers who had worked through the night without a single complaint. His gaze fell on Milo, who lay curled up beside a kitten that had been too weak to eat on its own. "You amaze me, buddy," Jonathan murmured. "You don't just give hope, you create it." Word of the rescue spread quickly. Local news outlets featured the story, highlighting the courage of the volunteers and the dedication of Edwards Haven. Donations poured in, along with messages of gratitude and offers to adopt the rescued animals. One message in particular caught Jonathan's attention. It was from a woman named Lisa, who had lost her dog in the flood and feared it hadn't survived. The description matched one of the rescues, a small black and white terrier that had been clinging to a piece of driftwood when they found it. When Lisa arrived at the shelter later that day, the reunion was nothing short of miraculous. The dog's tail wagged furiously as it leapt into Lisa's arms, and tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for saving him." Watching the scene, Jonathan felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Edwards Haven wasn't just about sheltering animals. It was about reuniting souls, giving people and pets a second chance at the love they deserved. That night, as the shelter quieted and the rain finally stopped, Jonathan sat with Milo on the porch, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of wet earth. He placed a hand on Milo's head, his voice soft. "You've shown me what it means to fight for something bigger than myself, and I promise you, we'll keep fighting for every life that needs us." Milo looked up at Jonathan, his eyes steady and full of trust. In that moment, they didn't need words. They were two souls, bound by loyalty, love, and a mission far greater than either of them could have imagined. Weeks after the dramatic rescue, Edwards Haven had become more than just a shelter. It was a symbol of hope. Stories of the animals saved from the industrial flood continued to circulate, bringing in a wave of support from across the community. Volunteers flocked to help. Donations arrived in record numbers, and local businesses stepped forward with supplies and services. The shelter buzzed with activity. But amidst the joy, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Late one evening, as Jonathan locked up the shelter, he paused in front of the framed photo of Edward and Milo that hung in the main hallway. "We've done so much, Edward," he murmured, his voice filled with both pride and longing. "But I feel like there's one more thing we need to do to truly honor you." The idea came to him the next morning, as he sat with Milo by his side, sipping his coffee and watching the sunrise. Edward's dream wasn't just about caring for animals. It was about creating connections, bringing comfort to those who needed it most. Jonathan realized that while they had saved many animals, they hadn't yet reached the people Edward had always wanted to help. He called a meeting with Sophia and the core team of volunteers later that day. "I want to expand Edwards Haven," Jonathan said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "I don't just want this to be a shelter. I want it to be a place where animals and people come together. A sanctuary that provides not only care but also healing." Sophia's eyes lit up. "You're talking about therapy programs," she said, excitement creeping into her voice. bringing the animals to hospitals, nursing homes, and schools, giving them a chance to spread the love they found here. Exactly, Jonathan replied. Edward believed in the power of animals to change lives, just like Milo changed his. It's time we take his dream even further. The team got to work immediately. They reached out to local hospitals and schools, pitching the idea of therapy visits with the animals from Edward's Haven. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Within weeks, Milo and a few other animals from the shelter made their first visit to a children's hospital. The sight of Milo wagging his tail as he walked into the room brought laughter and smiles to faces that had been weighed down by illness and worry. Jonathan stood in the corner, watching as Milo gently nudged a stuffed toy toward a little boy who hadn't smiled in days. The boy's laughter echoed in the room, and Jonathan felt a lump rise in his throat. This was Edward's dream in motion, a ripple of joy spreading through a moment of darkness. The visits quickly became a cornerstone of Edward's Haven. Each trip deepened the bond between the shelter and the community. Milo, now affectionately called the miracle dog by those who met him, was the heart of every visit. His calm presence brought comfort to elderly patients. His playful nature brightened the days of children, and his story inspired countless families to adopt and care for animals. But the most significant moment came during a special ceremony held in Edward's honor. Jonathan, Sophia, and the volunteers organized an event at the park Edward had loved so much, inviting the community to celebrate the life of the man who had inspired them all. Neighbors, former hospital staff, and even strangers who had been touched by Edward's story gathered, sharing memories and expressing gratitude. Jonathan stood before the crowd, Milo at his side, holding the letter Edward had written to Milo. Edward Hill taught us that love doesn't end with loss. Jonathan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It lives on in the connections we make, in the lives we touch, and in the hope we create. Edward's Haven is not just a shelter. It's a promise to honor that love every single day. The crowd erupted into applause, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan unveiled the new centerpiece of the shelter, a plaque in Edward's memory. It read, "In loving memory of Edward Hill, whose unwavering kindness and belief in second chances built this haven of hope. May his legacy guide us always." Milo wagged his tail, his gaze steady as he rested his head against Jonathan's leg. It was as if he, too, understood the significance of the moment. Edward's dream had not only been realized but had grown into something far greater, a legacy that would continue to transform lives for years to come. That night, as Jonathan sat on the porch with Milo by his side, he looked out at the shelter, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. "We did it, buddy," he said softly. "Edward's dream is alive, and because of you, it will never fade." Milo tilted his head, his eyes shining with quiet understanding. Together, they had completed a journey that had started with loss but ended in hope, a journey that proved that love, when nurtured, could build something unbreakable. Months after the ceremony in Edward's honor, Edward's Haven was thriving. The shelter had become a beacon of hope for animals and people alike. Therapy programs brought animals into hospitals, schools, and nursing homes, while adoption rates soared. Families found new furry companions, and countless lives, human and animal, were changed forever. Yet, for Jonathan, the journey felt far from over. One evening, as Jonathan walked through the quiet halls of the shelter, he found Milo sitting by the large window in the common area. The dog's gaze was fixed on the stars above, his calm presence as steady as ever. Jonathan smiled, crouching down beside him. "You know, Milo, we've come a long way, but I think Edward would say there's still more to do." As if in agreement, Milo wagged his tail lightly, leaning against Jonathan. The thought stayed with him through the night, filling him with both pride and a sense of possibility. The next morning, Sophia burst into his office, her excitement unmistakable. "Jonathan, you're not going to believe this," she said, handing him a letter. It was from a national animal welfare organization. They had heard about Edward's Haven and wanted to partner with them to create similar shelters across the country. They want us to share Edward's model, Sophia said, her voice trembling with emotion. They want to bring his vision to cities and towns that need it most. Jonathan stared at the letter, the weight of its implications settling over him. This could change everything, he said quietly. We could help so many more animals, connect so many more people. And, Sophia added, it all started because of Milo. Jonathan looked at the dog, who was now curled up near his desk, his eyes half closed. It's incredible, isn't it? Jonathan said. One dog, one act of loyalty, and now the world feels just a little brighter. The partnership was announced weeks later, bringing Edward's Haven into the national spotlight. Milo became the face of the initiative, his story shared in campaigns that inspired millions. Donations flooded in, and volunteers from across the country traveled to learn from the shelter. But with the growth came challenges, logistics, resources, and the need to balance expansion with the heart of what had made Edward's Haven special. Jonathan faced these challenges with the same determination that had carried him through every obstacle before. With Sophia and a dedicated team by his side, they began building new shelters in underserved areas, each one carrying Edward's name and vision. The work was exhausting but fulfilling, a constant reminder of the love that had started it all. One day, as Jonathan visited a newly opened shelter in a neighboring city, a young girl approached him, holding the hand of her mother. She was clutching a small stuffed dog, resemblance to Milo unmistakable. This is Max, she said shyly. He's my pretend dog, but my mom says I can get a real one from the shelter. Jonathan knelt down, smiling warmly. Well, Max sounds like a great name, he said, and I think you'll find the perfect friend here. The mother looked at Jonathan with gratitude. Thank you for this, she said softly. My daughter's been through a lot. This shelter, it's giving us something to look forward to. Jonathan's chest tightened with emotion as he watched the girl run toward a group of puppies, her laughter filling the room. In moments like this, he felt Edward's presence most strongly. This was what the man had believed in, the power of connection, the healing that came from love. As the years passed, Edward's Haven grew into a nationwide movement, its impact rippling far beyond what Jonathan had ever imagined. But no matter how far the journey took him, his bond with Milo remained unshakable. They were a team, united by a mission and the memory of the man who had brought them together. One quiet evening, Jonathan and Milo sat on the porch of their home, overlooking the original shelter. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Jonathan leaned back, resting a hand on Milo's head. We've done a lot, haven't we, boy? He said, his voice filled with quiet pride. But no matter how much we achieve, this place will always be home. Milo wagged his tail gently, his eyes reflecting the same calm, steady love that had carried them through every challenge. As the first stars appeared in the sky, Jonathan glanced at the framed plaque hanging above the shelter's entrance. Edward's Haven, a shelter of hope. Thank you, Edward, Jonathan whispered into the fading light, for showing us what love can do. Milo let out a soft sigh, resting his head on Jonathan's lap. Together, they watched the world settle into the stillness of night, knowing that the legacy they had built would continue to grow, touching lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. And so, the story of Edward's Haven lived on, a testament to loyalty, love, and the belief that one small act of kindness could change the world. What did you think of this incredible journey of loyalty, love, and hope? Did Milo's unwavering devotion and the creation of Edward's Haven touch your heart? If you enjoyed this story, drop a 2 in the comments below. Let us know you felt the magic. If it wasn't quite for you, feel free to comment with a 7. Your feedback matters, and we're always looking to improve. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the power of kindness, we'd love for you to share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Together, we can spread Edward and Milo's legacy even further. Don't forget to subscribe to Tapestry of Worlds, where we bring you more stories like this, tales that celebrate resilience, connection, and the extraordinary bonds that make life meaningful. Your support means the world to us, and it keeps these stories alive. See you in the next chapter.